Welcome to the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, silly, strange, and sublime aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the go-to parents, aren't always accepted at work, among their friends, or in the community for what they're doing. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan. Today, my guest is Colin Haupt, who has been a lead dad in two very different ways. A longtime HR executive, he joined Pure Insurance in 2010. It was a few years after the company was founded, and Colin was part of an amazing rocket ship ride as the company boomed into a leading personal insurance company. Fortunately, the office was only about 30 minutes from his house because his wife Allison was commuting across 3 states to Lord Abbett, an asset management firm where she rose to become a partner. Colin was the lead dad to their 3 kids as both of their careers took off. But life took a turn. After 7 years of battling breast cancer, Allison passed away in 2018. Some 18% of fathers in America are widowed, divorced, or single, and Colin became the lead dad and sole parent for their 2 daughters and son. With his daughters in college now and his son in high school, Colin left Pure at the start of the year to begin a workplace consultancy focused on mindful meditation, something that has helped him throughout the years. Welcome, Colin, to the Company of Dads podcast.
Thanks, Paul. Happy to be here.
How'd you and Allison meet?
Gosh, it's gone way back. Allison and I met through mutual friends in 1997.
Wow.
We were introduced through, it was kind of serendipitous in a way, because Allison's dearest and best friend from Darien, where she grew up, tried to connect us before we actually met formally and started dating, and the timing was off. And so whether it was, Allison was dating someone else, I was dating someone else, the timing just didn't work. For whatever reason, we were never able to connect. But in 1997, we met at her dear friend Bridget's house, her dad's house, for Bridget's engagement party to her then fiance. And it was like you hear, I guess, from time to time, it was immediate. I mean, I think it was sparks flew, and we were also at that stage in our lives where we were in our late 20s, almost 30, I think, both of us. And it just made a lot of sense. Besides the connection that we had, it made a lot of sense to be together. We had lots of similarities in terms of our interests. We had connections around friends and friend groups. We both loved New England, where I'm from New Hampshire originally. She's from Connecticut. And so anyway, it just made a lot of sense at the time, and glad we met.
What year did you get married?
I got married in 2001, May of 2001, right before 9/11, which was really interesting because we lived in the West Village at the time we got married. And when 9/11 happened, I was working about 6 blocks from Ground Zero on John Street, and Allison was working across the river at Lord Abbett in Jersey City. And when the first plane hit, I got a call from Allison on my cell phone saying, you need to leave your office building. Something, the plane just hit, one of the first World Trade Center. And I remember saying, I'm just going to stick it out. I'm going to stay around here and see what happens. And then the second plane hit, obviously, and I think we lost all communication. Everyone did, and made the decision to leave the building. But we were tested pretty early on. I think, just married in May, and then 9/11 happened right after that. Yeah. And we were separated for. She wasn't able to get back into the city. I wasn't able to get out of Manhattan for, I think it was about a week. So we spent that week apart. right after 9/11, which was really an emotional time for everyone, I think. But as a couple starting out together, I think um, it was really interesting. It tested us in ways I think we certainly never were going to expect at that time in our life. So anyway.
And then your first daughter was born when, like around 2004 or 5? What am I do my math here?
Yeah, Lily was born in November of 2002. So
2002. So okay.
yeah, we had just moved out from the city to Connecticut.
So, at that point, you have one child, you have another daughter, then you have a son. But you're doing well in your career in HR. She's, doing well in her career in asset management. What was the discussion you have, or did you have a discussion as to who was going to be, the lead parent?
We had, Paul, we went back and forth on it. I think we both agreed that we wanted to partner on that responsibility, and we also knew we wanted to have more than one child. So things get exponentially more challenging, obviously, the more kids you have. I think we talked about the challenge I think that Allison really had is that she was the breadwinner from the very beginning. She was in finance. I was in corporate HR. Just the compensation variables were pretty great, even early on in our careers. And I think we always knew that we didn't want to give up the compensation capability that Allison had to live the kind of lifestyle that we wanted to have. But it was always this back and forth discussion around how far does Allison want to travel in her career? Like how far up the proverbial ladder does she want to go before it gets to the point where she's working more than she's at home, right?
Right.
And but it was always a little bit of pressure around making sure we could live the kind of lifestyle that we wanted to live in Connecticut. So we discussed it a lot. And there was actually a period of time in 2010, right before I joined Pure, where I was with a company downtown on Hudson and Houston Street, and then Allison was commuting to Jersey City. So the two of us were actually
and living in Connecticut
and living in Darien.
Yeah.
And I did that for about 9 months, Paul. And I came home one night, and Allison was probably behind. We would try to commute together on the way home. She would go in much earlier than I would in the morning. And that's a whole nother conversation about her planes, trains, and automobiles to get to Jersey City.
Yeah, right.
But I remember her coming home exhausted one night, and I was too. And I remember looking at her in the kitchen, and I think Claire was just born, and so we had Lily, and then we had a newborn, and I just said, like, something's got to give. I said, you're the breadwinner, so what if I were to just kind of take a step back and leave my job and be a stay-at-home dad, at least for a period of time, and I could do some consulting from home.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately I did that. I actually left my job with a company called Publicis, which is a big media brand, and to be at home with the kids and do some consulting. So that was kind of my first foray, introduction into doing as a kind of lead dad. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, but so you're doing that, and then you get the call in 2010 to interview with Pure Insurance. You ultimately join them. It's a couple years old now. It's one of the biggest brands out there in sort of personal lines. But back then, it was just a couple guys who had a dream is to do something different and take on these established companies. What did you think? When you interviewed for that, did you think it was and it ends up being a rocket ship? So talk about the process of joining, and then how you balance the lead dad responsibility.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I got a phone call from the CEO's executive assistant. Her name was Nadine of Pure, and she she was taking on, as many executive assistants do, the role of recruiter for Pure.
Yeah.
And I remember her saying to me, she said a couple of things, but her introduction was, "We're looking for an HR person, and I don't want to do recruiting anymore." I said,
way to sell the job there. Way to really sell.
I know,
the
she
job
was
there.
great. And, it's interesting because she and I became very, very close colleagues. And for at least for the first 2 years at Pure, she and I were worked very closely with one another around a lot of different people initiatives. And I used to tease her, like, "Thanks for bringing me in here." It's been an amazing experience, but wow, what a lot of work. And to answer your question, I think for the first, at least for the first 2 years, if not longer, you're in startup mode, you're in build from scratch mode, which is you're doing everything. You're recruiting, you're doing benefits administration. We had outsourced some of these services, but it was really the first time in my career in HR where number one, I was doing everything, learning everything, areas that I had never worked in before on the fly, and also trying to help build a culture. I think was really the really most exciting thing about the Pure opportunity was that I was at a ground floor level in the world of HR professions. It's very infrequent that you get the opportunity to be able to be part of that.
Right. You're creating it. You're not inheriting it from somebody else. You're creating it.
Yeah. And so I always felt like it was a gift starting at Pure. And so that's kind of like how the transition. Anyway, so I went to interview and, after a couple of rounds of interviews and, was offered the job and came in and it was just an amazing experience, and then spent the next 12 and a half years there.
Yeah. But now on paper, I know Pure is based in White Plains. So on paper, Darien to White Plains, best circumstance, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, there's always traffic. So it seems like much better than commuting down to the tip of Manhattan. But, you join something and it booms from, tell me how many employees they have now and how many they had then, but it boomed. And so, and Allison is still, commuting over to Jersey City, which is top 10 miserable commutes you could have from Darien, Connecticut. And your kids are in elementary school. How do you then, balance this? Because, pretty soon you're not just going to White Plains. I know Pure has some other offices around the country. You're going there. How did that work for you, and her and your kids?
Great question. And I think what's the old adage? It takes a village. Like, it's not cliche in our case. I mean, it was using and asking for help of our neighbors, of our friends. I mean, Allison's, grew up in town in Connecticut and Darien. So we had like a built-in network already of friends and family here, including her mother, who has still to this day, after Allison's gone, has played just an amazing role in our family in terms of making sure the kids are cared for and checking in and taking, the girls and Christopher to, practice and confirmation class and you name it. And so we had that from a very early point. And the flexibility of our employers. I mean, even though Allison was commuting 3 hours a day, Lord Abbott was amazing. Lord Abbott had a very traditional conservative culture, and didn't really, they were figuring out at that point how to help employees with their, what we used to call work-life balance. I think now it's just life balance, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't really have this like flex work time kind of environment at Lord Abbott, but she was able to work it so that she could come home a little bit on the earlier side. She'd go in early, but she'd come home a little bit earlier. And that worked for her because she was home by the time the kids needed dinner. And And so I think it was a combination of flexibility, lots of help, and a look to the future that it wasn't always going to be like this. You know, it wasn't permanent.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what we always say. Your kids change, circumstances change. But was it fair that, if she's in Jersey City and you're in, White Plains, that if there was a crisis, and even if you had help, were you generally the one who would get in your car and come home early?
Yeah.
Yeah. And how was yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting. I think this is a natural segue into probably your next question, was how did Pure or Lord Abbott, deal with that, or help you with that? I'll never forget this. Early on at Pure, my middle daughter, was having some challenges at school, and Allison was in Jersey City, and I remember going into the CEO of Pure's office and just letting him know that I kind of had to get back to help Claire, and he just said, "Go, just go and do what you got to do. We'll figure it out." I think there was a bunch of either meetings or deadline meetings or whatever we had to do in the afternoon, and was able to kind of pick up where we left off. But that was instilled very early on with Pure, is that family came first, and we're all going to have challenges, and that was helpful, because not every company approaches it that way.
No, particularly back then. That's 2013 or something like that. 14, yeah. You started in 10, but you've established
13,
yourself.
14.
That was not working in the office meant you were playing golf or screwing off in some other way. It wasn't always that companies were enlightened enough to think that the dad could be the lead parent, and the dad could be the one who, for any number of reasons, for you, geographic proximity, would leave earlier. And there's no way your wife could have got home from that. It was an hour and a half away. What are you gonna?
Yeah. For an emergency, especially. Yeah.
When I said in the intro, Allison, fought cancer for 7 years, and so that was shortly after you joined Pure, she was diagnosed. How did the company handle things that you had to do to support your wife? Appointments you had to go with her, things that you had to do with her. What was their policy then to help Allison and to help yourself?
Yeah. So I think early on when Allison was diagnosed, she was diagnosed in February of 20. Oh my God, it's interesting. Tomorrow will be what is that, 2012. So tomorrow will be 11 years since her diagnosis, because she was diagnosed on Valentine's Day of 2012. So, and the reason I remember that explicitly is that I got a phone call from her right after her mammogram, and she was in tears. And she said, they're a little bit worried about this spot. And she was like, damn it, I totally screwed up. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, I totally screwed up. I did not get my mammogram at my 40th birthday. I skipped a year. And if I hadn't skipped a year, they would have found it. And I said, well, first of all, let's just slow down a minute. Like, we don't know, if it's cancer. We don't know what it is. But that was the first thing that came to her mind, was that she skipped a year, and that that was the kind of the culmination of the reason why if she had cancer, she had it. So anyway, fast forward a little bit, and to answer your question, I think early on I was unfortunately familiar with the story of breast cancer because my mom was diagnosed with it very early in her life and ended up passing away from it too. And so, for me, it was a little bit of deja vu all over again.
Yeah.
And so I was pretty open about it. Like when the confirmation came through that she actually did have breast cancer, we talked about it. We talked about her getting treated. We talked about her beating this early on. And to answer your question, Pure was great. Pure was amazing. They, again, I remember sharing it with, the CEO pretty early on after a diagnosis. And they were just all very supportive. And typically the first question I would get is, how's Allison? When I go into a meeting with our CEO, who I met with pretty regularly. So they were great in terms of her appointments and things that she needed to do. First of all, she was one of these people who didn't want anyone to join her at her appointments. She really didn't want me to come because her perspective was, there's nothing you can do to help me get through this appointment. Like, if you're coming for like emotional support, I don't need it. Number one, I'm fine, I'm good. I mean, she was pretty amazing. And I would ask a lot of questions, and I think that annoyed her because she kind of wanted to figure it out herself, digest it, and then be able to ask for support when she needed it. She was just that way. So,
and at that point, 11 years ago when she was diagnosed, how old were your kids then?
Gosh, Christopher was a baby. He was 11. He was 6 when she was diagnosed.
Okay.
And Claire, my middle, was 11, and Lily was 12.
Wow.
Yeah.
And at that point, we talk about, as we define, lead dad. Lead dad is the go-to parent, whether he works full-time, part-time, or devotes all of his time to his kids, and in many cases also, supports his wife in her endeavors. And so you're really at that point when Allison's diagnosed, you're doing it all. You're working at this rocket ship of a company. You got to be there for your kids, but you also have to really support your wife. And what was that like for you?
Yeah. You didn't realize you were going to get into a therapy session, did you? I think honestly, it was, this, like, part of it is adrenaline. Part of it is you just lean in, right? Because you have no choice.
Right.
I think Allison made it really easy. I hate to say that, but she made it really easy to be a support system to her in a lot of different ways. But most importantly, she didn't want the burden. She didn't want to feel like she was being a burden to anybody. And so that was probably her most amazing quality, is that she never wanted to feel like she was putting anyone out, including her husband. And it was just amazing. She, so I think, as a caregiver, like people say, like, gosh, being a caregiver must have been so hard for so long. But honestly, really the true caregiving for Allison was really not until she got super, super sick, which was like, early 2018. She was like a superstar. And she went through, a half dozen different treatments before the cancer caught up to her. And through every one of those, peaks and valleys, which really is what it was. It was a peaks and valleys roller coaster. You're waiting with bated breath to hear what the results are from the latest scans. I mean, we could have a separate podcast on that. it was amazing. I mean, she would just, belly up to the bar, and whatever the results are, let's deal with them. So I was very fortunate that she was the first line of, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, the first line of defense for me feeling like I was overwhelmed. And then people, Pure was great. We had lots of family and friends who were supporting. So it was a little bit of a blur.
Yeah.
I look back at it now.
I mean, one of the things that we've called for at the Company of Dads is to ask companies to create a designated basket of care days for employees.
Yeah.
So separate from sick days, separate from bereavement days, certainly separate from vacation days or not vacation days. And it could be used however the person wanted to, if, children, spouse, elderly parents. But it sounds to me like, even though, Pure didn't have a designated care days, it sounds like Pure and the CEO were really understanding of what was going on.
Oh, yeah.
And to put this into perspective, I mean, this company literally in your time went from probably, 100 employees to thousands and thousands of employees. It was eventually sold to a gigantic, Japanese insurance company. So this was like pure growth. Yet, the company's values were still to allow people to be human, to sort of their full life.
Yeah. And I think I remember we used to track it early on, but I think I was employee like 75 or something. When I left at the end of last year, we were somewhere around 1,200. So the growth was pretty amazing. I think, one of the things that I'm proud of so many things at Pure, not just of things that I was helping to shape, but the people that I hired were probably the most of what I'm most proud of. Is we hired people that really weren't just, we talk about this a lot at Pure, and I still refer to Pure in the present tense, which is really interesting. But we talk about like hiring people that care, that truly care. We have a recipe for identifying that, which is we put them through an empathy test, and if we sense that they're not capable of caring as human beings, we don't hire them. But on top of the caring, we also look for really important things that companies need to thrive, which is employees that are, intellectually curious about what's going on in their world, what's going on at the company, people who really value relationships and feedback, people who really enjoy the team environment and collaboration. So we put people through a little bit of a testing analysis and selection to make sure we're finding that. But the other piece that I'm most proud of is that we developed a program that allowed, to your point, people to take whatever time they wanted. We called it Flex PTO, but people think it was unlimited. It really wasn't. It was more, you've got like a certain amount of time each year during the work week and weekends, whatever it may be, where you've got to do things that are personal. And we're going to give you some guidelines and some guardrails, and then you just operate in the guardrails.
Right.
Don't worry about it. And if you go outside the guardrails, just let us know. That's how we did.
Been my argument, when people have said, like, if you institute care days, I was talking to somebody at a company last week, what if people abuse those care days? What if they take, all 10 of them or whatever? And I said, well, chances are if that person takes all 10 of those and abuses them, that person is not your best employee to begin with. And that person is doing other things wrong.
Yeah. We talked about that when we were creating this, and we found it, cause we were worried about the same issue. And yeah, we certainly had people that, we questioned, we tracked it, but we didn't, as you get bigger, you need to do more, some analysis on this, right? To look for patterns and trends. But we, early on, it was easier because we didn't have a huge team. And so you kind of knew where your outliers were. but I think we treated it like it was a gift. And if you treat people right, do the right thing, they're going to do the right thing for you. And
Yeah.
we never had a long-term issue with abuse of it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
As you said at the top, Allison passed away in 2018, and your kids then were in, high school, middle school, elementary school. I mean, just kind of working back on the math as to where they are now. They were young.
Yeah.
You're still working. How did you, when you think back, and I'm sure that was a blur as well, but the transition to a different type of lead dad while grieving, while grieving. But to be there for yourself and to be there for your kids, if you wouldn't mind, tell me a bit about how you were able to manage that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It is, I referred to it before as a blur. And I would kind of use some of the same description as I did before around Allison going through her treatments and how that whole balance worked. But like after Allison passed, I think, I knew she was going to pass away. So, I guess mentally I was preparing for it. I probably prepared for it longer, way earlier than many probably do, only because I kind of, as I said before, my mom passed away, and I kind of knew the signs to look for when things weren't working. And that's both a blessing and a curse, but it provided me some foresight into, I guess, planning for the worst case scenario was something that I did probably pretty early on. And but Allison and I never talked about it. That was the amazing thing, is that she did not even want to go down that path of, it's what if, what's the scenario if I'm not here? How are you going to figure this out? We didn't talk about that. And because for her, I felt like, and I people would always ask me, and I'd say, you got to let them drive the bus. Like, it's not my decision about how she wants to live her last 6 months or a year. It's hers. And so, but it was this balance between, in the back of my mind, planning, letting Allison live her life.
Yeah.
And then once she was gone, I think, it was clearly life changing. It's an understatement. But I took 3 months off from Pure. I kind of worked up to right before Allison died, and I think people were always amazed that I came into the office. And until you've been through a loss of a loved one that you're living with, I think you kind of need that space to, like, getting out of the house is really important. And Pure provided me that place to come to. It was almost like a refuge coming into the Pure office in the final weeks of Allison's life. And so, I came in up until about the time she passed away. And then after that, I kind of popped in from time to time. But again, Pure was so amazing in their flexibility. And whatever you want to do, Colin, like, come in if it's helpful, stay at home if it's helpful, whatever you prefer. And that's kind of when I pivoted from the head of HR job. It was about 9 months earlier than that. I kind of started to move away from kind of my lead HR role to this new head of employee engagement and experience role, where I had a little bit more flexibility, I think. And I had spoken about that with our CEO, or pretty early on too.
Yeah. So
they had already provided me kind of a transition to do this other work that had a little bit less spotlight on it.
Yeah.
Which was super helpful.
When you think about sort of your professional experience and your personal experience, and the whole program that you created for HR, but then how you just happened to be at a company that was super supportive of what you were going through. What are some of the things that you would want to share to other companies that are perhaps not as generous with their employees around, the time that those employees need to be human and not just workers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Such a great question, and I feel like it's there's some really basic universal things, and then I think then there's some situational environmental things that only a company can really figure that out based on their kind of where they are in their life cycle. For Pure, no, I mean, I think from a basics standpoint, I think, we talk about bringing your true full self to work each day. At least I do. Some of the work that I'm doing now as a consultant is, when I speak to companies, I talk about to your point, the human side that we have to live with as employers is, it's a little bit of the golden rule. Like, you're going to go through it yourself. And so let's try to relate to those individuals as employees that are going through it now, because it's bound to happen to you. But so from a human perspective, I think first, like giving, not just talking about it, but creating an environment where people actually can come to work each day, feel like they can share anything that's going through them, and training your managers. I mean, a big part of it is, how do we train and develop our managers to be able to take on that kind of conversation? It doesn't come naturally to a lot of people, especially in a work environment. So how do we give them the tools and the resources to have those conversations? There's a lot of work that Pure did on that, which I can talk about again. But so that's like my first comment would be, meet them where they are as humans, but walk the walk. And then I would say, like, and then hiring the right people, hiring the right people who have that empathy that I talked about earlier is really important. And listen, being empathetic doesn't mean you're easy, right? As a manager, right? Or you're like, you don't have tough conversations with your employees. We can have tough conversations with employees, but also be empathetic and care. So,
Colin, thank you so much for being my guest today on the Company Dads podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Best of luck with the Company of Dads.
Thank you. Hey, thanks for listening to Company of Dads podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. But I'm here to tell you, it's just one of the many offerings we have at the Company of Dads. We've got another podcast. We have a weekly newsletter. We have various features. We have events that we put on both online and in person. If you want to know about all of those, the best place to learn about them is to go to thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. That's thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. What do you get if you do that? That's how you sign up for our weekly newsletter, The Dad, which is a one-stop shop for all things Lead Dad. Thank you again for listening.